It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Janina Fisher, who will speak for around 45 minutes. Dr. Fisher is a licensed clinical psychologist with a former instructor at Harvard Medical School. She is an international expert on the treatment of trauma, a member of the advisory board of the Trauma Research Foundation, and the best-selling author in the area of healing from trauma. Dr. Fisher has become known for providing training and trauma-informed care to therapists, institutions, and programs, and even states and government. We will post links to Dr. Fisher's books and website in the chat. Today, she has very kindly offered to join us for a workshop titled The Neurological Benefits of 12-Step Work. We are so grateful to have you here, Dr. Fisher. I will now turn it over to you, and thank you so much for coming. You can unmute. I'll put it on your screen.
Yeah, there we go. Hi, everybody. Probably the most important qualification I have in the context of this group is I'm the adult child of an alcoholic father who was the founder of the first English-speaking AA group in Paris. Many years ago, he died with 53 years of sobriety at the age of 89, and he was still sponsoring. So he's my inspiration. And the other inspiration for this presentation was the widespread anti-12-step attitudes in the mental health community, which really disturbed me greatly as someone who has really been steeped in the 12 steps and know how incredibly valuable 12-step work is. It really bothered me that there was this very negative attitude among therapists. And so I wanted to originally I created this as a presentation to try to convince therapists that there is value in strongly encouraging their clients to commit to 12-step work. So I'm excited to share it with this group. Yeah. Now, why are we interested in neurobiology? Why would that be a convincing argument for the skeptical? Because of the relationship between trauma and addiction. The research shows that up to 70% of individuals in addictions treatment programs have histories of trauma. That is way too big a number to be a coincidence. Yes, addiction is an illness, but it's an illness that affects people who've been traumatized at a much higher rate. We also know that the risk of relapse seems to be much higher in people who have a history of trauma. And in the trauma world, we discovered that what makes trauma have long-lasting effects, including making individuals more vulnerable to addiction, is the brain. That trauma doesn't just leave emotional effects, it changes our brains. Because when we're exposed to threat, the thinking part of the brain, the part of the brain that has judgment and principles and has learned from experience, that part of the brain shuts down when we're threatened. And instead, parts of the brain are activated that are beneath words. Most famously, the amygdala, which is a teeny tiny structure in the brain, it's the brain's smoke detector and fire alarm. So when we feel a sudden hit of anxiety, or when we have an uneasy sense that something bad is happening, that's the amygdala. And whoops, wait a minute, come back here a second. So when individuals are traumatized, the effects of the trauma are lodged in the smoke detector, which is very inconvenient because it means that we become sensitized to anything, even vaguely threatening or reminiscent of the traumatic environment. And so it creates an accident that is waiting to happen, because years and years and years later, the amygdala starts to fire as if we are being threatened again. We also know from studying the brain that these nonverbal memories, which is essentially what they are not experienced as memories. People don't feel anxious and say, oh, I'm remembering how scary it was. They feel desperate. They feel despair. They long to die. They're jumping out of their skin or have terrible social anxiety, agitation, or they're angry, mistrustful, hypervigilant, ready to run at the drop of a hat. And sometimes they experience shame and numbing, because you don't survive trauma feeling everything there is to feel. We survive trauma by going numb and helpless and limp so that it isn't made worse. If we're kids being traumatized, we feel hopeless and helpless. And those nonverbal memories are very easily stimulated in the face of disappointments and, all the little defeats of daily life. And the fact that most abuse is perpetrated by parents or parent figures means that there are also traumatic nonverbal memories of a yearning for closeness, of profound loneliness, and fears of abandonment. All of these are memory. The problem is, if you remember an event, it's a memory. If you feel fear, how do you know when it's a memory and when it's not? When you feel there's no more hope, how do you know if it's a memory or if it's not? The nervous system also gets traumatized in a threatening world. But the nervous system is meant to have the capacity for high arousal when we need to fight or run, and very, very low arousal when we need to submit or dissociate or go numb. Now, ideally, we're not in a traumatic world every day, so we don't experience those intense fight-flight responses or anger or fear and we don't feel the numbness and loss of energy of low arousal. And most of the time, ideally, our feelings and reactions fluctuate within what's called the window of tolerance. That refers to our bandwidth. How much bandwidth do we have for our thoughts, our feelings, our physical reactions? How well do we tolerate intense feelings? How well do we tolerate feeling disconnected and numb? Can we think and feel at the same time? When you're in high fight-flight arousal, you can't think and feel at the same time. Same with very low arousal. So many survivors of trauma have symptoms that reflect having survived with that high arousal state. They're impulsive, they're risk-taking, their judgment sucks. They have what I call post-traumatic paranoia, which means that we fear something that's already happened, right? Someone's out to get me. Everybody hates me. That's post-traumatic paranoia, because if you're abused in the context of your family, you feel like everybody hates you. Mistrust, hypervigilance, all of those are related to that high arousal. Also flashbacks and intrusive images, which are not quite as bad as flashbacks, but very, very disturbing. And also, high arousal is associated with suicidal, self-destructive, and addictive behavior. We also have clients or individuals in our worlds who have chronic symptoms of low arousal, reflecting that to be safe in their worlds, or safer in their worlds, they had to be chronically numb. They had to be chronically not there. I have a client whose mother's favorite words were, "Suck it up," or "somebody's going to get hurt." Today, she's an adult who can't feel her feelings ever, except anger. That's the one feeling she can feel. When we have chronic low arousal, our thinking is slow. It's hard to think. It's hard to say no. The pattern of chronic caretaking that we often call codependence can emerge from the inability to say no. Again, no one recognizes that as memory. They just know, I can't say no, so of course I'm doing everything for everybody again. So I call this the post-traumatic roller coaster. Some of you may be familiar with it. It starts with the fact that because the brain and the nervous system are so sensitive to anything that might be a danger signal, the survivor is constantly feeling overwhelmed, feeling disturbing feelings and reactions, and feels impulsive, even though that same person might be saying, "I'm not going to do it, I'm not going to do it." There's a strong, strong impulsive response. And what does that do? Most people, when they're triggered by everyday things, they start to avoid, they start to isolate. Right? Their lives begin to revolve around avoiding whatever is triggering, all the people, places, and things that are triggering. But the problem with isolation is the more you avoid, the more you isolate, the less information you get. So there you are alone with the triggering and the overwhelm without any information getting in. Oh, there are people who care about me. I'm not crazy. And so the feeling of threat actually increases the more we attempt to avoid it. And that leads to more and more efforts to avoid in different ways. And the more we avoid, the worse the symptoms get. The more panic, the more anger, the more intrusive images or memories. And finally, usually by accident, individuals begin to engage in some kind of compulsive behavior or substance abuse, and I include food under substances. And miraculously, they discover that little bit of compulsive behavior or substance use lowers their activation and brings them relief. But as you all know all too well, that the drug effect of every substance and every compulsive behavior wears off, right? Anything addictive has a drug effect that eventually wears off. And so what happens is an increasing need to do more and more to get that same original effect. So as if it's self-injury, it becomes more severe. If it's anorexia, the restricting of food becomes more rigorous. If we're talking about drugs, more and more harder drugs, a multitude of mixtures of drugs, anything to recreate that initial relief. Because the fear of feeling is greater than the fear of dying. Often, as the addiction gets deeper, more active, more dangerous, more and more suicide seems like the only answer. But underneath that is this terror of the feelings, which makes the fear of death feel like nothing. I just remember with so many of my clients who were addicts, I would say, you have a life-threatening illness. That didn't mean anything because the fear of the feelings was much, much bigger and scarier. So the assumption that I make is that sobriety, therefore, is only the beginning. Is sobriety necessary? Absolutely. I certainly have always believed that in order to do any therapeutic work on the trauma, anyone has to be sober and has to be stably sober and has to have a program. But sobriety is just the beginning, because once individuals get sober, they've lost that mechanism that keeps the trauma at bay. And so the risk is that somewhere between a week and a year or two post sobriety. The post-traumatic memories, not the event memories, the feeling memories, start to become more and more intense, which of course triggers relapse impulses. So we have to look at recovering from both. Now, the other problem, as I often describe it to my clients, is that when addictions give you a false window of tolerance, at least at the beginning, there's this short period where it feels like one has a window of tolerance. In sobriety, there's no window of tolerance because what tolerance the individual has had is no longer there. So a colleague of mine many years ago, who was herself in recovery, developed the abstinence relapse cycle to describe what happens as a result of trauma. So our individual has become sober or abstinent, losing the chemical support. I put it in quotes because you all know all too well that it's really a fake chemical support, which leads either immediately or slowly to an increase in trauma symptoms. But they don't appear as trauma symptoms because often it's just feeling overwhelmed, feeling irritable, feeling reactive, having an incredibly sensitive reaction to triggers. And so what most people experience is, I'm getting worse, not better, which of course triggers impulses to use. But they're not always obvious. Sometimes clients of mine have said, I'm feeling this need to use, but often, and you all will recognize this, it's disguised, right? My client is saying, I deserve a drink. This is, usually it's more in the impulses to use appear as resentment and self-pity. And usually the impulses to use go hand in hand with the increase in PTSD symptoms, leading at some point to a relapse. But not so much as a drug-seeking relapse, but as a panicked attempt to try to get some of that relief back. And of course, the results of a relapse are always negative. And so at some point, our individual gets sober again, and the cycle starts again. I remember working with a 50-year-old man with multiple addictions, food, alcohol, sex, and he was also a binge user of crack cocaine. And I remember I would show him this diagram, and he'd say, "No, don't bring out the baseball." And I knew from his reaction to this diagram where he was in the cycle. It took him a very long time to see that the cycle was happening, despite his being someone who went to multiple 12-step meetings every week. Now, you know that that despite all the evidence, all the testimony, that 12-step programs are the most effective approach to addiction. Judith Herman, who's one of the founders of the trauma field, used to say, I wish that all of my clients were able to do 12-step work, because 12-step work is really good for trauma. But unfortunately, meetings and the program can be triggering. And so you probably hear the resistance. You may have experienced it. You may have gone through it yourself. And of course, it makes sense, because there are many, many triggers. Right? A meeting is held in an enclosed space, not if it's online, but back when meetings were in enclosed spaces. Being in a group, feeling exposed, feeling the pressure to talk, worse yet, feeling the pressure to self-disclose, and the language of spirituality. For women who've been sexually abused, often meetings with older men would trigger feelings that they weren't safe. I can remember a client whose mother was a cocaine addict who was triggered by meetings because she looked around the room and felt that now she was no better than her mother. And so one of the things that's important for trauma recovery, as well as addictions recovery, is to address what's triggering about a particular meeting, or what's triggering about the use of the word God. And so we have to remember that if you get traumatized in the context of normal life, family, neighborhood, school, the triggers are going to be in the family, the neighborhood, work. And there are many things that are not obvious. We're all used to women who have been abused by men being triggered by male people. But things as simple as having to wait, people being late, being surprised. Often being alone is triggering, and being in a group is triggering. Remember, a lot of people get traumatized in a group, in a family group. And so they get triggered in fellowship groups. Being watched, which could mean being the center of attention, having to speak, not being able to speak, all can be triggers. And so the triggers, you probably all can recognize the triggers in any 12-step meeting. People are being vulnerable. People are being confronted. There's complaining or self-pity going on. And so all of those things can be triggering. So when someone is newly sober and is having trouble with 90 and 90, having trouble tolerating meetings. I've had many clients who would go to meetings and leave 15 minutes or half an hour into the meeting because they couldn't tolerate the triggering. And so what I wanted to teach therapists is that these are just side effects of 12-step programs. And there are side effects of going to a therapist. There are side effects for visits to psychiatrists, to group therapy, and many, there are side effects to doing nothing. And so, of course, we all encourage newly sober individuals to find the right meetings for them, to find smaller meetings if they're triggered by groups, to find same gender meetings. The young woman whose mother had been a cocaine addict all through her childhood finally found the right meeting for her. It was noon meetings for young professionals. And she felt, okay, if they're alcoholics too, then I'm okay. I'm with my peers. I think therapists have to be really clear. Sponsors obviously are clear that being triggered is not a reason to avoid 12-step meetings. Right? It would be like saying, "Oh, I'm never going to the doctor because going to the doctor is triggering." And so that's my bottom line when I'm working as a therapist with anyone in recovery. Now, here's why 12-step programs work so well for trauma. This Joseph Ledoux is an expert on the brain. And he says it's all about the amygdala, right? The fire alarm. In order for the amygdala to fire, the prefrontal thinking brain has to be shut down. So he says, okay, if you want to treat that fear, you have to help people learn to increase activity in their thinking brains. And that turns off or turns down the volume on the amygdala. Without the prefrontal cortex being awake, new information can't get in, old information can't get in. We can't learn from experience, right? If insanity consists of doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, that's really on the prefrontal cortex, because it's only the prefrontal cortex that can say, hey, whoa, you did this before. Look how it turned out. So what 12-step programs do is they offer new information, lots and lots of new information, but in simple language that even an inhibited prefrontal cortex can process, right? One day at a time, so simple, right? Keep it simple. There's not much complicated thinking that has to be done. Just have to remember the words. So 12-step programs promote new habits of mind. Lots of new habits, right? Don't project. Recognize projecting. Learn to accept other people's shortcomings in order to get what's valuable. Right? Rigorous honesty. There's a very important habit of mine. Even thinking the words, what's the next right thing? We're promoting a new habit of mind. The traumatized brain doesn't ask, what's the next right thing? The traumatized brain says, run, fight, hide. So that constant repetition of slogans, of 12-step principles, of concepts over and over and over again in simple language fosters the ability to learn even in a very traumatized brain. And what's lovely, as you know, is that even when the newly sober individual is kicking and screaming and 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 asking over and over again, will I ever be able to drink? Nonetheless, the repetition is having an effect. It's having an effect on the brain, whether the individual is conscious of it or not. In one of the most important things that most individuals don't know, most of us never knew, is epitomized in this slogan from Recovery Inc., which is a self-help program, not a 12-step program, but a self-help program for individuals with mental illness. Feelings and sensations will rise and fall and run their course unless we assign danger to them. If feelings and sensations rise and we assign danger to them, they rise even further. And so trauma leads to automatic assumptions of danger. So something is triggering and people feel their heart starting to pound, or they feel tight in the chest, or their stomachs tighten, or they feel frozen. We assign danger to those feelings. If you've, I'm sure, all known many people who start to cry and then shut it off because they have beliefs. Crying is weakness. I'll be humiliated if I cry. I'll be vulnerable to attack if I cry. Trauma really imposes beliefs about ourselves. It was my fault. It's not safe to trust. Well, it wasn't safe to trust, for sure. But that it wasn't safe to trust has become a global belief. It's not safe to trust people. No wonder asking for help is a central piece of 12-step work. So when the prefrontal cortex shuts down and we assign danger, the body prepares to either flee or fight, to act. You can see the risk for relapse, or we go numb and passive and we don't care, which also puts us at risk for relapse. So one of the most regulating effects of 12-step programs has to do with prayer and meditation. There's actually lots of research that shows that meditation is a good treatment for trauma, that it regulates the nervous system, so we have more of a window of tolerance. And I think prayer does the same thing, right? So when we pray, our bodies get calmer. And so a very, very, very important piece that has a neurobiological benefit. All the slogans are calming to the nervous system. And it's helped by the fact that there's a rhythm and a simplicity to them. So often, if I just begin to say the serenity prayer, I feel calm. Because the more we use the slogans and the serenity prayer, the more the body begins to respond with soothing and regulating. I'm turning it over. One of the best ways to combat obsessive thinking, because of course, obsessive thinking is assigning danger. And so it threatens the nervous system. You know, it's funny because many of the therapists for whom I wanted to design this talk say, well, 12-step programs are cults. and I just have to laugh because part of what they're talking about are the slogans, are the pieces of 12-step work that are repeated over and over again. The way a meeting begins, the way it ends. All of those things are misunderstood as cult-like rather than understood as being a powerful way of regulating the nervous system and creating the conditions under which people have a window of tolerance. Because sobriety can either take effortful work, or as the window of tolerance grows, it becomes easier to use the skills, to use the principles, to use the walk. And because it becomes habitual, how do we learn habit? Through repetition. Also, there is something very, very comforting about the consistency and predictability. I did long-term Naranon work. Naranon work is the family program connected to NA. And that consistent, predictable way that each meeting went was in itself very, very regulating. Yeah, I forgot to say I'm also the mother of addicts, as well as the daughter of an addict. Just the idea of walking the walk and talking the talk are all about developing new habits of mind. And all the experts in the trauma field agree that to combat trauma, you need non-traumatic habits of mind. And often in trauma treatment, we say to our clients, even if you don't believe that some new information is true, use it. Anyway, you don't have to believe in something to try it out. Just see for yourself. Notice if it's helpful. And of course, we all know that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is the definition of insanity. Acceptance. You know, it's interesting because self-compassion is sort of the new buzzword or in the trauma field. Acceptance is self-compassionate, right? When you accept your powerlessness, when you become entirely ready, when we can accept character defects, we're practicing self-compassion. And self-compassion is good for the nervous system. It's good for the brain. It's good for our characters. One of the easiest ways to help people begin to develop this acceptance habit of mind is to ask them to be curious, right? I would say trauma survivors and addicts have usually lost their curiosity. And so curiosity, not intellectual curiosity, like, why is this happening? But a curious state of mind. Because if we're curious, if we're interested, this part of the brain comes online. And our body, and when this part of the brain comes online, the amygdala calms down. So in the trauma field, we teach individuals to notice when they're triggered, to notice, does your nervous system go up or does it go down? And then we help them experiment with what regulates that traumatic activation, right? 12-step work is filled with interventions that regulate the nervous system, that regulate the activation, right? Whether it's reading, praying, turning it over, going to another meeting, saying the serenity prayer. And this is only a small list of the ways in which 12 steps offers anyone ways of helping to transform a traumatized nervous system into a nervous system that can tolerate emotion, day-to-day stress, without having to use or self-destruct. And the other thing that I think is inherent in 12-step programs is this really epitomized in this quote. I love this quotation because when I found it, it reflected exactly my attitude. If I accept you as you are, I will make you worse. If I treat you as though you're already capable of being, of what you can become, I will help you become that. And I think that's inherent in 12-step work. No matter how far you've fallen, just keep talking the talk and walking the walk. Just keep saying one day at a time. And I can think of so many clients who said, I can't go to a meeting. I can't say the serenity prayer. I can't deal with God. And the key is that we treat them as people who already have that capacity. They just haven't walked the walk yet. And I think that's very, very, very powerful. So I want to end with some of the quotations and slogans that help me when I work with trauma and addiction, right? I can't do it all. I can't do it for other people, and I can't do it all. So I remember Jesse Jackson's quote, "You're not responsible for being down, but you are responsible for getting up." And I think that's a 12-step message, right? Addiction is an illness, but you're responsible for getting up. you're responsible for how you manage that illness. From Naranon, your role as helper is to be things, not to do things. It's amazing how when we're in the helper role, we want to do things. But Naranon reminds us, no. Your role as helper is to be things, not to do things. And then when I have no idea what to be, I keep in mind these words from Deepak Chopra. In the midst of movement and chaos, keep stillness inside of you.